The bass from the speakers vibrated through the floorboards of Nina's loft as I pressed my back against the exposed brick wall, trying to make myself smaller in the crowd of bodies celebrating my 25th birthday. My fingers traced the condensation on my untouched mojito, the mint leaves bruised and wilting in the melting ice. I'd never been comfortable at parties, especially ones thrown in my honor, where expectations hung in the air like the string lights Nina had draped across the industrial ceiling beams. "You look like you're about to bolt." Nina appeared at my elbow, her crimson lipstick somehow still perfect 3 hours into the night. She'd insisted on this party, on the guest list, on everything down to the playlist that currently assaulted my eardrums with electronic beats I didn't recognize. I managed a weak smile. Just taking it all in. Liar. She clinked her glass against mine with enough force to slosh liquid over the rim. "You hate this. But I promise, you'll thank me later." Her eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that usually preceded one of her matchmaking schemes. "There's someone I want you to meet. Henrique Castro. Remember I mentioned him?" The name meant nothing to me, though Nina had been dropping it casually into conversation for weeks. Something about antiquities, about business connections, about how we'd be perfect together. In that infuriating way people with happy relationships always assumed compatibility could be engineered. "Nina, I'm really not—" "He's here." She cut me off, scanning the crowd. "Somewhere. I specifically invited him for you. Trust me on this one, Gabby." Before I could protest further, she was swallowed by the throng of guests, leaving me alone again with my dying mojito and the familiar weight of social anxiety settling across my shoulders like a heavy coat. I pushed off from the wall, navigating toward the terrace where the night air might offer some relief from the press of bodies and the cloying sweetness of perfume mixed with alcohol. The terrace was blessedly empty, the city sprawling below in a tapestry of lights that blurred together like watercolors. I gripped the railing, inhaling deeply, tasting exhaust and distant rain on the cool October air. This high up, the street noise faded to a gentle murmur, almost peaceful compared to the chaos inside. "Running away from your own party?" The voice froze me in place. I knew that voice, had spent a year trying to forget its particular timbre, the way certain syllables caught just slightly in the back of his throat. I turned slowly, hoping I was wrong, knowing I wasn't. Hugo Abreu stood in the doorway, backlit by the party beyond, looking exactly as he had the last time I'd seen him, when I'd found him in our shared apartment with someone else. His sandy hair still fell across his forehead in that calculated, casual way. His smile still carried that boyish charm that had first attracted me, and his presence still made my stomach twist with a complicated mix of anger and something uncomfortably close to the ghost of old feelings. "What are you doing here?" My voice came out steadier than I expected, though my fingers tightened on the railing until the metal bit into my palms. "Nina invited me." He stepped onto the terrace, closing the distance between us with the easy confidence of someone who'd never learned to read a room. "Said it would be good for us to talk, to reconnect." Nina wouldn't. But even as I said it, I knew she might. Nina believed in forgiveness, in second chances, in grand romantic gestures. She'd never understood why I'd cut Hugo out completely, why I'd refused to engage with his increasingly desperate attempts at reconciliation over the past year. "She thinks we were good together," Hugo continued, moving closer until I could smell his cologne. The same expensive brand he'd always worn, the scent triggering a cascade of memories I'd worked hard to suppress. "She thinks what happened was a mistake. A one-time thing that I've regretted every day since." "Stop." I held up a hand, finally finding my spine. "I don't care what Nina thinks she knows about us. You don't get to show up here and... I miss you, baby." The pet name hit like a physical blow. He'd called me that constantly during our 2 years together, whispered it in the dark, laughed it over morning coffee, used it as punctuation in every conversation. Hearing it now felt like being doused in ice water and scalding oil simultaneously. That's not your name to use anymore. I tried to step past him, back toward the safety of the party, but he caught my wrist. Gabby, please. Just 5 minutes. Let me explain. His grip wasn't painful, but it was firm enough to stop me, possessive in a way that sent alarm bells ringing through my chest. I opened my mouth to tell him to let go, to cause a scene if necessary, when a different hand appeared, larger, darker, the fingers wrapped around Hugo's wrist with casual authority. That's my baby you're touching. The voice was deep, accented with something Mediterranean that softened the consonants, and completely unfamiliar. I looked up into the face of a stranger, a man I'd never seen before, with close-cropped dark hair threaded with premature silver at the temples, a jaw that could have been carved from marble, and eyes so dark they appeared black in the terrace lighting. He wore a charcoal suit, with the jacket unbuttoned, the white shirt beneath open at the collar in a way that suggested he'd dressed up but refused to be entirely constrained by formal wear. Hugo released my wrist immediately, stepping back as if burned. Who the hell are you? Enrique. The stranger, Nina's mysterious guest, didn't take his eyes off Hugo, though his hand moved to rest at the small of my back, warm through the thin fabric of my dress. And you're leaving. Gabi, do you know this guy? Hugo's face had gone red, embarrassment warring with indignation. I should have said no. Should have corrected the misunderstanding, explained that Enrique was just someone Nina had invited, that we'd never even been properly introduced. Instead, I looked up at this man who'd materialized like some avenging angel and felt something reckless unfurl in my chest, something that had been sleeping for a year under layers of hurt and caution. Yes, I heard myself say. I know him. Hugo's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. You can't be serious. Him? You move on with... I believe the lady asked you to leave. Enrique's voice remained pleasant, conversational even, but something in it made Hugo take another step back. There was a quality to the way he carried himself, a stillness that paradoxically suggested coiled movement, like a predator deciding whether it was worth the energy to strike. Whatever, Hugo threw up his hands in defeat. This is pathetic, Gabi. He's probably just using you, but you'll figure that out. He stormed past us, back into the party, and I watched him disappear into the crowd with a mixture of relief and residual adrenaline, making my hands shake. Enrique's hand remained at my back for a long moment, before he stepped away, putting appropriate distance between us. I apologize for the presumption. Nina mentioned you had an ex who couldn't take a hint. When I saw him corner you... He shrugged, a gesture that managed to be both elegant and dismissive. I improvised. You didn't have to do that. I turned to face him properly, seeing details I'd missed in the confrontation, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight crook in his nose suggesting it had been broken at least once, the way his suit fit like it had been made specifically for his frame. But thank you. My pleasure. His mouth curved in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, which were studying me with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. Though I suspect I may have complicated your evening. My evening was already complicated. I found myself smiling back, that reckless feeling growing stronger. Something about the way he'd handled Hugo, the casual authority of his intervention, had awakened something in me that I'd thought Hugo had killed, a willingness to take risks, to step outside my carefully maintained comfort zone. So tell me, Enrique Castro, do you make a habit of rescuing women from their exes at parties? Only when the woman in question looks like she'd rather face a firing squad than have a conversation. He moved to stand beside me at the railing, looking out over the city rather than at me. And only when said ex doesn't understand that no is a complete sentence. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the party noise a muted backdrop to the night. I studied his profile, trying to reconcile Nina's description of him as mysterious and intense with the man who'd just defended me without making me feel weak or incapable. There was something magnetic about him, a pull I couldn't quite name but felt in the way my pulse had quickened when his hand touched my back. "Nina says you deal in antiquities," I ventured, curious despite myself. "Among other things." His answer was deliberately vague. "I buy and sell beautiful things, art mostly, sculptures, paintings, artifacts, items with history, with stories. Sounds fascinating." "It can be." He turned to look at me then, and the full force of his attention was like standing too close to a fire, warming and slightly dangerous. Though, lately, it's felt more like inventory management than treasure hunting. The romance of it fades when you're negotiating customs paperwork. I laughed, surprised by the mundane complaint from someone who looked like he'd never dealt with anything as pedestrian as bureaucracy. That's not how Nina described it. She made it sound very glamorous. International deals, exclusive auctions. Nina has a talent for embellishment. He smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes, softening his features in a way that made him look younger, more approachable. The reality is mostly long flights, boring authentication meetings, and arguing with appraisers who think they know more than they do. Sounds like any other job. Exactly. He paused, then added, "Though I do get to travel to interesting places, see things most people only encounter in museums." The way he said it suggested depths I couldn't quite fathom, layers beneath the surface charm. Before I could probe further, Nina burst onto the terrace, her expression oscillating between horror and excitement. "Oh my God, I just saw Hugo storming out. What happened? Did you two—" She looked between us, taking in the way we stood angled toward each other, the invisible thread of connection that had formed in the past few minutes. "Wait, did you actually meet? Finally?" "We met," Enrique confirmed, his tone dry. "Though not quite under the circumstances you planned, I suspect. He defended my honor," I added, unable to resist needling my friend. "After you apparently invited my cheating ex to my birthday party." Nina had the grace to look ashamed. He seemed so sorry, and you two were so good together before." "Before he slept with someone else," I finished. "Yes, we were great right up until that moment." "I'm an idiot." Nina grabbed my hands, squeezing apologetically. "I just wanted everyone to be happy and coupled up and... God, I'm so sorry, Gabby." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." And surprisingly, I was. The encounter with Hugo had been uncomfortable, but Enrique's intervention had transformed it from humiliating to almost empowering. Though maybe vet the guest list with me next time? Never again, I promise. She released my hands, then turned to Enrique with a hopeful expression. "But at least you two finally met. Silver lining?" "Indeed." Enrique's gaze returned to me, something unreadable in its depths. "Though I'd like to properly introduce myself without the drama. Enrique Castro." He extended his hand. I took it, feeling the warmth of his palm against mine, the controlled strength in his grip. "Gabriela Freire. Though apparently you already knew that." "Nina may have mentioned you. Once or twice, every time we've spoken for the past month." His mouth quirked at our friend's expense. "She's subtle like that," I agreed, and we both looked at Nina, who was grinning like she'd orchestrated the entire evening to reach this exact moment. "Okay, I'm going to leave you two alone now," she announced. "Try not to do anything I wouldn't do." She winked and disappeared back inside, leaving us alone on the terrace once more. The silence that followed wasn't awkward exactly, but it was charged with something I couldn't quite name. The reckless feeling from earlier returned, stronger now, pushing me past my usual caution. "So," I said, surprising myself with my boldness. "You called me your baby. Does that mean I'm yours now?" The question hung between us, provocative and teasing in equal measure. I watched Henrique's expression shift, surprise giving way to something darker, more interested. When he spoke, his voice had dropped half an octave, intimate despite the space between us. "Not yet." He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the individual threads of silver in his hair, smell the subtle cologne that was nothing like Hugo's, something with cedar and smoke, expensive but understated. "But I could try to earn that title, if you'd let me." My heart was doing complicated things in my chest, beating too fast and too hard. This wasn't like me. I didn't flirt with strangers, didn't respond to obvious lines with anything but polite deflection. But there was something about Henrique, about the way he defended me without making me feel diminished, about the directness of his interest that made me want to step outside my usual patterns. "How would you earn it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dinner." He said it simply, as if offering a meal rather than everything that might come after. "Tomorrow night? Somewhere quiet where we can actually talk without—" He gestured vaguely toward the party. "All this." I should have said no. Should have thanked him for his help and gone back to my safe, Hugo-free existence. Instead, I found myself nodding. "Okay." "Okay." He pulled out his phone, handed it to me. "Put in your number. I'll send you the details." I typed in my contact information with slightly trembling fingers, handed the phone back. Our fingers brushed in the exchange, and the small contact sent electricity up my arm. Henrique noticed. I could tell by the way his eyes darkened further, but he said nothing, just pocketed his phone and stepped back. "I should go," he said. "Let you get back to your party. But Gabriela?" He waited until I met his eyes. "Thank you for saying yes." Then he was gone, moving through the party with the same quiet authority he'd shown on the terrace, disappearing into the crowd before I could formulate a response. I stood alone, my mojito forgotten and completely melted, trying to process what had just happened. I'd come to this party dreading every moment, had been cornered by my ex, and had somehow ended up with a dinner date with a man who made my pulse race just by looking at me. Nina appeared at my side again, vibrating with barely contained excitement. Oh my God, what did he say? Are you seeing him again? Did he ask you out? I knew you two would be perfect." "Nina," I cut her off gently. "Thank you. For inviting him. I gestured helplessly. "All of it." She squealed and pulled me into a hug that nearly lifted me off my feet. "This is going to be amazing. I can feel it. Henrique is exactly what you need. Someone who won't let you hide, who'll—" "Remind me later that I agreed to this," I interrupted, "when I'm panicking about what to wear and whether this is a terrible idea." "It's not a terrible idea." Nina pulled back, her expression suddenly serious. "Gabby, you've been stuck for a year. Stuck in safe, stuck in careful, stuck in not Hugo. Maybe it's time to try stuck in something new." I looked back toward the terrace door, half expecting to see Henrique there, watching. But he was truly gone, leaving only the memory of his hand at my back and a promise of dinner that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Tomorrow night, I thought. Tomorrow night, I would let myself fall. I woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through my bedroom curtains and the disorienting sensation that the previous night had been a vivid dream. My phone sat on the nightstand, silent and accusatory, and I reached for it with the kind of dread that comes from knowing you've done something reckless while sober. 3 missed calls from Nina. 2 texts asking if I was alive and whether Henrique had contacted me yet. 1 message from an unknown number that made my stomach flip. "Good morning, Gabriela. Dinner reservation at 8 p.m. I'll send a car at 7:30. Dress comfortably. We're going somewhere without pretense. H. I read it 3 times, analyzing every word choice, every implication. A car. Not I'll pick you up, but I'll send a car, which suggested a level of formality that contradicted the dress comfortably instruction. And that sign-off? Just the initial? As if I'd know exactly who H was despite having met him only hours ago. My finger hovered over the reply button for a full minute before I typed, "Looking forward to it." His response came immediately. "As am I." I set the phone down and stared at my ceiling, trying to reconcile the cautious person I'd been for the past year with the woman who'd flirted with a stranger and agreed to dinner without knowing anything substantial about him. Nina had mentioned his business, something about antiquities and art, but the details were vague, and that way people describe things they didn't fully understand themselves. The day passed in a blur of second-guessing and wardrobe changes. By 7 o'clock, I'd settled on dark jeans, a silk blouse in deep emerald, and the leather jacket I'd bought during a rare moment of retail therapy after the Hugo breakup. Comfortable, but intentional. Casual, but considered. At precisely 7:30, my building's intercom buzzed. "Miss Frere, your car has arrived." I grabbed my purse and headed downstairs, expecting perhaps a town car or a sedan. What waited at the curb was a sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows, and a driver in a charcoal suit who opened the rear door with practiced efficiency. "Good evening, Miss Frere. Mr. Castro asked me to ensure your comfort. There's water in the console if you'd like." I slid into the leather interior, feeling immediately out of my depth. This wasn't a casual dinner car. This was the kind of vehicle that transported people to important meetings, to exclusive events, to lives I'd only seen in movies. The driver pulled smoothly into traffic, navigating the city streets with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. We drove for 20 minutes, leaving the familiar neighborhoods behind for an area I recognized but rarely visited. The waterfront district where old warehouses had been converted into expensive lofts and exclusive restaurants. The car pulled up in front of a building with no visible signage, just a single door flanked by subtle lighting. "Mr. Castro is waiting inside," the driver informed me, coming around to open my door. I stepped out into the cool evening air, nerves and anticipation warring in my chest. The door opened before I could knock, revealing a small vestibule and a narrow staircase leading up. At the top, Enrique stood silhouetted against warm light, dressed in dark pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. The first time I'd seen him in anything approaching casual. "Gabriella," he smiled, descending to meet me halfway. "Thank you for trusting me with such vague instructions. I figured if Nina vouched for you, you probably weren't planning to murder me," I said, then immediately regretted the dark humor. His laugh was genuine, transforming his face from intimidating to almost boyish. "Nina's vouching is worth its weight in gold, then. Come, I hope you're hungry." He led me up the stairs to a private dining room that took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor, where boats bobbed gently in their slips, and the city lights reflected on dark water. A single table was set for 2, intimate without being claustrophobic, and soft music played from hidden speakers, something instrumental that I couldn't quite place. "This is..." I struggled for words that wouldn't sound inadequate. "This is beautiful." "It's one of my favorite places in the city," Enrique said, pulling out my chair. "The chef is a friend. When I explained I wanted somewhere we could actually talk, he offered the private room." I sat, watching as he moved to the other side of the table with an easy grace that suggested he was comfortable in his body, comfortable in spaces like this. A server appeared. The chef himself, I realized, based on his whites, and the familiar way he greeted Enrique. "Bruno, this is Gabriella. Gabriella. Bruno Machado, the magician who will be feeding us tonight." "A pleasure," Bruno said warmly. "I've prepared a tasting menu if that suits. Small courses, opportunity to talk between, unless you have dietary restrictions I should know about." I shook my head, still processing the casual intimacy of the whole arrangement. This wasn't a restaurant reservation. This was a favor between friends, a level of access that suggested Henrique moved through the world with doors opening before he even approached them. The first course arrived. Scallops with some kind of citrus reduction that tasted like summer and the sea combined. We ate in silence for a moment, and I tried not to feel self-conscious under Henrique's periodic glances. "So," he said finally, setting down his fork, "tell me about Gabriela Freire. What do you do when you're not attending birthday parties and fending off exes?" "I work at a museum," I said, grateful for the familiar territory of professional discussion. "Conservation department. I restore damaged paintings mostly. Renaissance through early modern. It's meticulous work, lots of magnification and chemical analysis and patience." His eyebrows rose with what appeared to be genuine interest. "That's fascinating. So you understand art, understand history embedded in objects." "I understand how pigments degrade over time, how varnish yellows, how canvas contracts and expands with humidity." I smiled, warming to the subject. "The history is secondary to the chemistry, really. But yes, I love knowing that I'm touching something that survived centuries, that I'm helping it survive centuries more. That's—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "That's not dissimilar to what I do, actually. Preservation through acquisition, making sure important pieces end up in hands that will care for them." "Nina said you deal in antiquities?" "Art, primarily. Paintings, sculptures, decorative objects from estate sales, private collections, occasionally auction houses." He took a sip of wine, his gaze never leaving mine. "I connect buyers with sellers, ensure authenticity, handle logistics. It's less romantic than it sounds." "You mentioned that last night, the customs paperwork." "Among other bureaucratic nightmares." His mouth quirked. "Though I won't bore you with the intricacies of import regulations." The second course arrived, some kind of fish with delicate herbs that I couldn't identify but tasted incredible. We talked more easily now, the conversation flowing from art to travel to books we'd read and cities we'd visited. Henrique had been everywhere I'd only dreamed of: Venice, Florence, Athens, Cairo. And he spoke about these places with the casual familiarity of someone for whom international travel was routine rather than extraordinary. "What made you get into conservation?" he asked during the third course, lamb that practically melted on the tongue. I considered the question, tracing the stem of my wine glass. My grandmother was a painter. Nothing famous, just local landscapes and portraits, but she taught me to see the world as composition and color. When she got dementia, she'd forget everything else, but she could still identify a Caravaggio from a Rembrandt, just by the way light fell across a face. I paused, surprised by the emotion in my voice. She died when I was 20. I chose conservation partly to honor her, partly because I wanted to be close to art without the pressure of creating it. Henrique's expression had softened during my explanation. "She sounds remarkable." She was. I changed the subject before the grief could surface. "What about you? How does someone end up in the antiquities trade?" "Family business, initially. My father dealt in maritime salvage. Ships, cargo, artifacts recovered from wrecks. I grew up handling things that had spent centuries underwater, learning to recognize value in corroded bronze and waterlogged timber." He smiled at the memory. "When he retired, I shifted focus to terrestrial acquisitions. Fewer sharks, literal and metaphorical." "Only metaphorical sharks now?" I teased. "The metaphorical ones are often more dangerous." Something shadowed his expression briefly before he shook it off. "But yes, the business has evolved. These days it's more about relationships than diving expeditions. Knowing who wants what, who's willing to sell, making connections." The meal continued through several more courses, each more exquisite than the last, while our conversation ranged across topics with the ease of people discovering unexpected compatibility. Henrique was well-read, well-traveled, and possessed a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard and made me laugh more than I had in months. He asked questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite small talk, and when I spoke, he listened with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like the only person in the world. By the time dessert arrived, something chocolate and perfect, I'd almost forgotten this was a first date, that I'd known this man for less than 24 hours. The ease between us felt both natural and slightly surreal, like stepping into a life that didn't quite belong to me. "Thank you for this," I said, as Bruno cleared our plates. The meal, the setting, all of it. This was extraordinary. "The company made it extraordinary," Henrique replied, and the line should have sounded cheesy, but somehow didn't. Though I have a confession to make. My stomach clenched slightly. "What kind of confession?" "I asked Nina about you before last night. More than just your name and profession." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "I wanted to know who I was meeting, whether you'd find a place like this pretentious or charming." "And what did Nina tell you?" "That you're brilliant at your work but underestimate yourself. That you're kind almost to a fault. That your ex destroyed something in you that deserves to be rebuilt." His gaze intensified. "That you're worth the effort of rebuilding it." I didn't know what to say to that. The directness of it. The implication that he saw me as some kind of project to be undertaken. Before I could formulate a response, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, frowned, and stood. "Excuse me a moment. Work complication that can't wait." He stepped away to take the call in the vestibule, leaving me alone with the harbor view and the unsettling feeling that I'd just glimpsed something beneath his polished surface, some complexity that contradicted the smooth charm he projected. When he returned, his expression was carefully neutral. "I apologize. That was unavoidable." "Everything okay?" "Fine. Just a shipment delay that needed addressing." He signaled for the check, which Bruno waved away with a meaningful look that suggested this meal was also a favor rather than a transaction. "Let me take you home." The drive back was quieter, both of us lost in thought. When the car pulled up in front of my building, Henrique walked me to the door despite my protests. "Thank you again," I said, suddenly awkward now that the evening was ending. "I had a wonderful time." "As did I." He stepped closer, and my breath caught. For a moment I thought he might kiss me, but instead he took my hand and raised it to his lips. An old-fashioned gesture that should have felt ridiculous, but instead felt intimate. "May I see you again?" "Yes," I whispered, my pulse racing at the contact. "Good." He released my hand slowly. "I'll call you." I watched him return to the car, watched it pull away into the night, then let myself into my apartment in a daze. Only when I was inside, door locked behind me, did I allow myself to process the evening, the luxury of it, the easy conversation, the way Henrique looked at me like I was something precious he'd discovered and intended to keep. My phone buzzed with a text from Nina. "So." I smiled despite myself and typed back, "He's taking me out again." Her response was a series of celebratory emojis that made me laugh. But as I got ready for bed, another text arrived from the unknown number that was no longer unknown. "I'm already counting the hours until I see you again. Sleep well, Gabriella." I fell asleep thinking about his hand at my back on Nina's terrace. About the way he defended me without hesitation. About how someone I'd just met could make me feel simultaneously safe and wonderfully off balance. Somewhere in the city, Henrique Castro was probably working late on whatever business complication had interrupted our dinner. And tomorrow, I'd wake up to the reality that I was falling for a man whose world I didn't fully understand, whose layers I'd barely begun to uncover. But tonight, I let myself simply feel the thrill of possibility, of doors opening onto paths I'd never imagined walking. Whatever came next, at least I was moving forward instead of standing still in the ruins of what Hugo had broken. 3 months. That's how long Enrique and I had been seeing each other when he offered me the position managing his gallery. 3 months of dinners at exclusive restaurants, of weekend drives to vineyards I'd only read about, of conversations that stretched into the early morning hours as we discovered the architecture of each other's minds and histories. I sat in my conservation lab at the museum, staring at the email he'd sent that morning. I'm opening a legitimate gallery space downtown. Acquisitions, exhibitions, public viewings. I need someone with your eye, your expertise, your integrity. The position is yours if you want it. We can discuss details over dinner tonight. The offer was generous, double my current salary, benefits, and the opportunity to work with pieces that rarely saw museum walls. It was also complicated by the fact that we were sleeping together, that the lines between professional and personal had long since blurred into something I couldn't quite map. That's quite the frown for someone looking at a Baroque masterpiece. I looked up to find my supervisor, Dr. Marta Silva, standing in the doorway. She'd mentored me since I'd started at the museum, had taught me everything I knew about varnish removal and canvas restoration. Sorry, just thinking. About the Enrique Castro offer, I'd imagine. At my surprised expression, she smiled. Word travels. A man like that opening a gallery looking for a curator. People talk. And I know you've been seeing him. Is it that obvious? You've been distracted for months, arriving late with better excuses than usual, smiling at your phone during lunch breaks. She crossed to my workstation, examining the painting I'd been restoring, a minor Tintoretto that needed delicate attention. He's offering you the position? I nodded, unable to articulate the tangle of excitement and apprehension the opportunity created. And you're wondering if it's real or if you're being managed, Marta supplied. If the job offer is genuine or just another way of keeping you close. Something like that. She was quiet for a moment, her experienced eyes assessing layers I couldn't see. I've known men like Enrique Castro. Powerful men who move through the world reshaping it to their preferences. They're intoxicating. The attention, the resources, the way they make you feel like the center of the universe. She paused. But they're also dangerous, Gabriella. Not always in obvious ways, but in how completely they can consume your life if you let them. You think I shouldn't take it. I think you should go into it with clear eyes. Make sure the terms are truly professional, that you have autonomy, that you're building something for yourself rather than just orbiting his world. Her expression softened. You're brilliant at what you do. Don't let anyone, even someone you're in love with, diminish that by making it about them, rather than about your talent. The word love hung in the air between us. I hadn't used it, hadn't allowed myself to examine the depth of what I felt for Enrique beyond the surface excitement of new relationship energy. But Marta had named it, and now I couldn't unname it. I do love him, I admitted quietly. Which terrifies me. Good. Fear means you're paying attention. She squeezed my shoulder. Just make sure he's worthy of both the love and the fear. And protect yourself, Gabby. Always protect yourself. That evening, I met Enrique at his penthouse rather than a restaurant, our relationship having evolved to the point where privacy mattered more than public venues. He'd cooked, which still surprised me every time I discovered this domestically capable side of him, beneath the power suits and business calls. You're quiet, he observed as we ate pasta he'd made from scratch, the silence between us comfortable but weighted. Thinking about your offer. He set down his fork, giving me his full attention. And? I want to understand what it means. The position, the gallery, all of it. I met his eyes. I need to know this is about my abilities, not about keeping me in your orbit. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at my directness. I'm opening the gallery regardless of whether you take the position. It's been in planning for over a year, since before we met. But yes, when I realized I needed someone to run it, you were my first thought. He paused. Not because you're sleeping with me, but because you understand art at a level most people in this business only pretend to. You see the soul of a piece, not just its market value. But we're together. That complicates things. It does, he agreed. Which is why I'm offering you a contract, legal terms, complete autonomy over acquisitions and exhibitions within the gallery's focus. You'd report to me as the owner, yes, but the creative and curatorial decisions would be yours. He pulled a folder from the counter, slid it across to me. Have your lawyer review it. Hell, have Marta review it. I want you in this position, Gabriella, but I want you there because you're the right person, not because you feel obligated. I opened the folder, scanning the contract. The terms were indeed generous, more than generous. Salary, benefits, profit sharing on sales, and remarkably broad authority over the gallery's artistic direction. It was the kind of opportunity people spent careers working toward, handed to me at 26. Why now? I asked. Why open a public gallery when you already have a successful business? Enrique was quiet for a long moment, his wine glass rotating slowly between his fingers. Because I'm trying to evolve. The private dealing, the connections, the shipments. It's profitable, but it's also insular. I want something visible, something that contributes to the cultural landscape, rather than just moving valuable objects between wealthy owners. That's very altruistic. Don't mistake it for altruism. His smile was wry. There's plenty of money to be made in the legitimate gallery world. But yes, part of it is wanting to build something I'm not embarrassed to discuss at dinner parties. The admission was surprisingly vulnerable, a glimpse beneath the confidence he wore like armor. I thought about Marta's warning, about protecting myself, about entering this with clear boundaries. But I also thought about the paintings I'd seen in Henrique's private collection, about his genuine passion for art that transcended mere acquisition. I'll have my lawyer review the contract, I said, and I need to give the museum proper notice, at least 2 months. Of course. His relief was visible. Take whatever time you need. The gallery space won't be ready before then anyway. We finished dinner talking through his vision for the space, the kinds of exhibitions he wanted to mount, the balance between established artists and emerging talent, the community outreach programs he envisioned. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself getting caught up in the possibilities despite my lingering caution. Later, in his bed with the city lights painting patterns across the ceiling, Enrique pulled me close and said, I know I'm asking a lot. Your trust, your career, your time. But I promise I won't waste any of it. What if it doesn't work? I asked into the darkness. The gallery, us. What if we fail? Then we fail having tried something worth the risk. His fingers traced patterns on my shoulder. But I don't intend to fail, Gabriella. Not at this. The confidence in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it made me think of Marta's words about powerful men reshaping the world to their preferences. Enrique didn't just accept failure as a possibility. He seemed to view it as something that happened to other people, not to him. Over the following weeks, I had the contract reviewed, gave my notice at the museum, and began the strange transition from conservator to gallery director. Enrique involved me in every decision: the space selection, the renovation plans, the initial acquisition strategy. It felt collaborative, equal, like we were building something together, rather than me simply executing his vision. But there were moments that gave me pause. Like when a piece I wanted to acquire for the opening exhibition suddenly became available despite the owner having refused to sell for years. Or when permits that typically took months materialized in days. Enrique had connections, influence that extended into areas I didn't fully understand, and he wielded that influence casually, as if doors opening before him was simply the natural order of things. How do you do it? I asked one evening, as we reviewed floor plans for the gallery. Make the impossible happen so easily? He looked up from the blueprints, something unreadable in his expression. Relationships, mostly. I've spent years building a network of contacts, people who owe me favors or want to be owed favors in return. It's currency, Gabriella. Just a different kind than money. What kind of favors? Introductions, mostly. Access to collections, to auctions, to opportunities. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Nothing sinister, if that's what you're asking. But I hadn't been asking about sinister until he mentioned it, and now the question hung between us like smoke. What exactly did Henrique's network entail? How deep did his influence run? And what would happen if I ever needed to extract myself from his world? I pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the tangible excitement of the gallery taking shape. We hired staff, planned our inaugural exhibition, sent invitations to collectors and critics whose names I'd only seen in art journals. My days were full in ways they hadn't been at the museum, the work challenging and creative and completely absorbing. It was 3 days before the gallery's opening when I finally met someone who made all my suppressed concerns crystallize into something I could no longer ignore. I was at the gallery space, overseeing the installation of paintings, when a man I didn't recognize walked through the unlocked door. "Can I help you?" I asked, putting myself between him and a Modigliani worth more than my apartment building. "I'm looking for Henrique Castro." The man's accent was thick, Eastern European, and his suit was expensive, but worn in a way that suggested he lived in it, rather than just wearing it. "You are the girlfriend, yes? Gabriella?" "I'm the gallery director," I corrected, unease prickling along my spine. "And we're not open yet. You'll need to come back next week." "I think Henrique will want to see me now." He pulled out his phone, dialed, and after a brief exchange in a language I didn't understand, handed it to me. "He wants to talk to you." I took the phone cautiously. "Henrique?" "Gabriella, everything's fine. This is Alexi, an old associate. Let him into my office, please. I'll be there in 10 minutes. "You have an office here? Since when?" "Since I'm the owner and occasionally need private space to conduct business. Top floor, east corner. The key is in your desk drawer." His tone was patient but firm. "Please, just trust me on this." I wanted to argue, to demand explanations, but the installation crew was watching, and Alexi was standing too close for comfort. "Fine. 10 minutes. I led Alexi upstairs to an office I hadn't known existed, furnished with a desk and chairs and nothing personal. A space clearly designed for transactions rather than occupancy. He settled into one of the chairs without invitation, and I stood by the door, arms crossed. "You are very protective of his things," Alexi observed with what might have been amusement. "This is good. Henrique values loyalty." "I'm protective of the gallery's assets," I corrected. "And you still haven't explained what you want." "That is between me and Henrique," he smiled, revealing gold teeth that seemed deliberately ostentatious. "But do not worry, pretty lady. I am not here to cause problems, just to collect what is owed." Before I could ask what that meant, Henrique appeared in the doorway, his expression controlled, but cold in a way I'd never seen. "Alexi, I thought we had an understanding about unannounced visits. The understanding was payment by end of month. Month is ending tomorrow." Alexi stood, all pretense of friendliness evaporating. "You have what I came for?" "Of course." Henrique moved to the desk, unlocked a drawer I didn't have a key to, and withdrew a thick envelope. "As agreed. Count it if you'd like." Alexi took the envelope, thumbed through what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash, and nodded. "Always a pleasure doing business with you, Henrique." He glanced at me. "Take care of him, gallery lady. He is valuable man." Then he was gone, leaving Henrique and me alone in the office. The silence stretched uncomfortably until I found my voice. What was that? Payment for a shipment he facilitated. Nothing concerning. Cash? In an envelope? That's how legitimate business works? Henrique's jaw tightened. Some associates prefer discretion. It's not illegal, Gabriela. But it's not exactly transparent either. I moved closer to the desk, to him. What aren't you telling me about your business? About the connections you use to make the impossible happen? He sighed, the careful control slipping to reveal something like resignation. My father's maritime salvage operation wasn't entirely above board. Some of the cargo he recovered had questionable provenance, and I inherited those connections along with his legitimate contacts. He met my eyes. I've spent the last decade trying to separate myself from that world, building the legal side of the business, but I can't completely sever ties with people like Alexei without consequences. What kind of consequences? The kind where valuable pieces become mysteriously unavailable, where auction houses suddenly develop concerns about my bidding, where shipments get held up in customs indefinitely. His voice was matter-of-fact, as if describing weather rather than implied threats. I don't engage in his business anymore, Gabriela, but I maintain the relationships enough to keep them neutral rather than hostile. I wanted to ask more about what exactly his father had been involved in, about how deep those connections ran, about whether the gallery was truly separate from that world or just a more palatable face of the same enterprise. But the opening was in 3 days. Critics and collectors were coming, and I'd committed myself to this path already. No more surprises, I said finally. If there are other Alexeis in your life, I need to know about them before they show up in my gallery. Our gallery, he corrected gently. And I promise, no more surprises. It was a promise he would break within the month, but in that moment, I chose to believe him. Because the alternative was confronting how thoroughly I'd entangled myself with a man whose world had depths I hadn't even begun to measure. And I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. The gallery's opening was a triumph that felt hollow beneath the surface. Critics praised the exhibition I'd curated, a careful balance of established names and emerging artists, thematically centered around transformation and preservation. Collectors made acquisitions totaling more than I'd dreamed possible for a first show. Henrique moved through the crowd with easy charm, introducing me as the brilliant mind behind the vision, and I played my part perfectly. Gracious, knowledgeable, the consummate professional. Only Nina noticed the tension I carried in my shoulders, the way I flinched when Henrique's hand settled at my waist. She cornered me near the champagne table during a lull in conversations. Okay, what's wrong? You should be glowing right now, and instead you look like you're waiting for something terrible to happen. I glanced around, confirming we were out of earshot. Have you ever looked up Henrique's business? Really looked beyond the surface? Her expression shifted from concern to something more guarded. Gabi, I introduced you to him knowing exactly who he is. His father ran salvage operations that weren't always strictly legal, yes, but Henrique's been working for years to legitimize everything. You knew? The betrayal stung more than I expected. You knew and didn't think to mention it? What would I have said? Hey, the guy who rescued you from your ex has complicated business connections? You wouldn't have given him a chance. She squeezed my arm. Look, I know Henrique. Have known him for 5 years. He's been nothing but honorable in every interaction I've witnessed. Whatever you've discovered, talk to him about it. Before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew our attention. Hugo stood in the gallery doorway, clearly drunk, his tie askew, and his eyes wild with the kind of rage that comes from too much alcohol and wounded pride. There she is, he announced loudly enough to silence nearby conversations. My ex playing art dealer with her mafia boyfriend's dirty money. Henrique materialized beside me with frightening speed, his expression a cold mask I'd only glimpsed once before, when Alexei had shown up unannounced. You need to leave. Now. Or what? Hugo lurched forward, swaying slightly. You'll have me killed? Isn't that what guys like you do? Make problems disappear? I felt the attention of the entire gallery focusing on us, phones emerging to capture the scene, and my carefully constructed professional evening disintegrating into public drama. Hugo, please. Please what? Pretend you're not sleeping your way into a career? His laugh was bitter, cruel. I know what this is, Gabby. I know what he is. And everyone else should know too, before you help him launder more money through fake art sales. The accusation hung in the air, ridiculous, but damaging simply by being spoken. Henrique's hand tightened on my waist, and I felt the coiled tension in him, saw in his eyes the calculation of someone deciding between violence and restraint. Security, he said quietly, and two men I'd assumed were guests revealed themselves to be something else entirely, moving to flank Hugo with practiced efficiency. Escort Mr. Abreu from the premises, gently, but firmly. As they removed Hugo, still shouting accusations that became less coherent as he was guided toward the exit, the crowd's attention shifted to me, to Henrique, to the uncomfortable question now hovering over everything. How much of Hugo's drunken ranting was actually true? Ladies and gentlemen, Henrique addressed the room, his voice calm and authoritative. I apologize for that disruption. The individual has a history with Miss Freire and clearly hasn't handled their separation with grace. Please continue enjoying the exhibition. Gabriella has worked too hard for months for one disturbed man to ruin her achievement. It was masterful damage control. Within minutes, conversations resumed, the incident already transforming into gossip rather than scandal. But I saw the way some of the collectors looked at Henrique differently now, the way certain critics made their excuses and left earlier than planned. I made it through the rest of the evening on autopilot, my professional mask firmly in place, even as my mind raced through implications and consequences. When the last guest finally departed, leaving only staff to clean up, I found Henrique in the upstairs office, speaking quietly on his phone in that same language I didn't understand, the one he'd used with Alexei. He ended the call when I entered, his expression unreadable. Are you all right? What did Hugo mean about laundering money? I asked directly. Is any of that true? No. The answer was immediate, emphatic. Every piece in this gallery has legitimate provenance. Every sale will be properly documented and taxed. I won't let my past contaminate what we're building here. Your past that includes what, exactly? Maritime salvage with questionable provenance? Connections to people like Alexei who deal in cash and intimidation? I moved closer, needing to see his face clearly. Who are you really, Henrique? Beyond the dinners and the charm and the promises. He was silent for a long moment, something warring behind his eyes, the desire to protect me from ugly truths versus the need for honesty I'd demanded. Finally, he sighed and gestured for me to sit. My father didn't just salvage cargo. He facilitated shipments for people who couldn't use conventional channels. Art, antiquities, items that had been stolen or smuggled, that needed to move across borders without attracting attention. He poured himself a drink, didn't offer me one. I worked for him from 16 until he died when I was 28, learned the business, made connections, built relationships with people on every side of legality. My stomach twisted with the confirmation of what I'd suspected but hoped against. So Hugo was right. Hugo was right about my history. He's wrong about my present. Henrique's voice was steady, factual. When my father died, I inherited an enterprise that was maybe 30% legitimate. I've spent the last 6 years converting the rest, buying out questionable contracts, redirecting relationships toward legal operations. The gallery is part of that, visible proof that I'm building something clean. But you still pay people like Alexei in cash envelopes, because severing ties completely would make me a target. These aren't people you simply walk away from, Gabriella. He met my eyes. I'm navigating a transition between two worlds, trying to reach one without being destroyed by the other. And yes, sometimes that means maintaining relationships I'd rather not have. And I thought about the museum position I'd left, the straightforward world of conservation where the worst ethical dilemma was whether to over-restore a damaged section. I thought about Marta's warning about powerful men consuming lives, about how completely I'd allowed myself to be drawn into Henrique's orbit. I need some time, I said, standing, to think about what this means, whether I can... Gabriella, wait. He rose, too, desperation cracking through his usual control. I know this is a lot. I know I should have been more forthright earlier. But everything I feel for you, everything we're building here, it's real. It's separate from the complications. Is it? I asked quietly. Or am I just another piece you're acquiring, another element of your transformation into legitimacy? The question landed like a physical blow. I saw it in the way he flinched, the way his careful composure finally shattered completely. You think I'd spend months courting you, offering you a position you're overqualified for, opening myself up to you in ways I haven't with anyone else, just for appearances? His voice was raw. Gabriella, I love you, not for what you represent or how you make me look. I love you because you see beauty in damaged things and believe they can be restored. Because you're brilliant and kind and completely unimpressed by the power and money that everyone else orbits around. Because when you look at me, you see past all the complications to who I'm trying to become. The declaration hung between us. The first time either of us had said those words despite months of implying them through actions and intimacy. And I wanted to believe him. Desperately wanted to believe that what we had was separate from his business entanglements. That love could exist cleanly amid all the complications. I need to go home, I said instead of responding. I need space to think. He didn't try to stop me this time, just watched as I gathered my things and called a car service rather than accept his driver. As I descended the gallery stairs into the cool night air, I heard his voice from above. I meant what I said, every word, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove it to you. The drive home passed in a blur. My phone buzzed repeatedly, texts from Nina asking if I was okay, a message from Marta saying she'd seen photos from the opening online and asking what happened, and 3 calls from an unknown number I didn't answer. It wasn't until I was safely in my apartment, door locked and lights off, that I allowed myself to fully process the evening. The success of the exhibition, Hugo's attack, Henrique's confession, the declaration of love that I couldn't bring myself to return despite feeling it echo in my own chest. My phone lit up with another message, this time from Henrique. I know you need space. I'm giving it to you. But please know that I'm not going anywhere. When you're ready to talk, I'll be here. I set the phone down without responding, staring instead at my ceiling in the darkness. Somewhere in the city, Enrique was probably making calls, managing the fallout from Hugo's disruption, navigating the complicated world he'd been born into, and was trying to escape. And here I was, in love with a man whose past terrified me, whose present was built on foundations I didn't fully trust, whose future seemed to demand that I accept risks I'd spent my entire life avoiding. The question wasn't whether I loved him. I did, completely and terrifyingly. The question was whether love was enough to bridge the distance between our worlds, whether I could build a life with someone who still had one foot in shadows I couldn't see into, whether I was strong enough to stand beside him as he completed his transformation, or whether I'd be consumed by the complications he carried. I fell asleep without answers, knowing that morning would bring decisions I wasn't ready to make, but that couldn't be postponed much longer. Because whether I chose to stay or walk away, my life had already been irrevocably changed by loving Henrique Castro. The only question now was what shape that changed life would take. 3 years. That's how long it took for the full weight of Henrique's past to finally crash down on us, threatening to destroy everything we'd built together. I was in the gallery's conservation room when federal agents arrived, their credentials already in hand before I'd processed their presence. Special Agents Carvalho and Esteves, introducing themselves with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. We have some questions about several acquisitions made through this gallery, Agent Carvalho said, producing a list of items that made my stomach drop, specifically about their provenance and the channels through which they entered the country. Every piece on the list was legitimate. I'd personally verified their documentation, traced their ownership histories, ensured that nothing we exhibited had questionable origins. But I also knew that federal investigations rarely began with the evidence they'd eventually use to prosecute. They started with questions, looking for inconsistencies, building cases from small contradictions that snowballed into larger prosecutions. I'm happy to provide any documentation you need, I said, maintaining professional composure despite the panic rising in my chest. Everything we've acquired has complete provenance records. We don't doubt that, Ms. Frere. Agent Esteves' smile didn't reach her eyes. We are more interested in the network that facilitated these acquisitions, the contacts who connected sellers with buyers, who arranged international shipping, who navigated customs procedures with unusual efficiency. They were investigating Henrique, using the gallery as an entry point into his broader operation. I saw it clearly now. The careful way they phrased questions about contacts and networks, the interest in logistics rather than the art itself. I need to call our lawyer, I said, reaching for my phone. Of course. We'll wait. Agent Carvalho settled into a chair with the patience of someone who had all day. The lawyer arrived within the hour, a sharp woman named Teresa Abreu, who'd been on retainer since the gallery opened, specifically for situations like this. She reviewed the agent's warrant, then advised me in terse whispers before addressing them directly. My client will cooperate fully with documentation requests. However, questions about business relationships and third-party contacts should be directed to Mr. Castro himself. Ms. Frere's role is curatorial. She authenticates and exhibits art. She's not involved in the acquisition logistics you seem interested in. It was true, technically. I deliberately stayed separate from that side of the business, focusing on the artistic integrity of exhibitions rather than the mechanics of how pieces arrived. But I wasn't naive. I knew Henrique's contacts facilitated our acquisitions, knew that his network extended into areas that federal agents found interesting. After 3 hours of careful questioning and document copying, the agents finally left with promises to return and warnings about the consequences of withholding information. The moment the door closed behind them, I called Enrique. They were here, federal agents, asking about acquisitions and your contacts. I know. His voice was tight, controlled. They visited my office an hour ago. I'm with lawyers now. Don't talk to anyone else about this, Gabriela. Not Nina, not former colleagues, no one until we understand the scope of their investigation. What did you do? The question emerged harsher than intended. What triggered this? I don't know yet, but I promise you, everything we've acquired for the gallery is completely legitimate. Whatever they're investigating, it's about my other operations, not what we've built together. But that distinction felt meaningless when federal agents were questioning me, when the gallery I'd poured 3 years of my life into was being used as evidence against the man I loved. When I finally got home that evening, exhausted and terrified, I found Nina waiting in my building's lobby. I saw it on the news, she said without preamble. Federal investigation, your gallery, Henrique's name mentioned. Gabi, what the hell is happening? I led her up to my apartment, poured us both wine I desperately needed, and told her everything. The agent's questions, Henrique's past that I'd learned 3 years ago, the complicated web of relationships he'd been slowly extricating himself from. Jesus Christ, Nina breathed when I finished. I knew about his father, knew the business had complicated origins, but federal investigation. Gabby, this is serious. I know. I took a long drink, the wine doing nothing to settle my nerves. They asked me to testify. Informally, through implications, but clearly, they want me to provide information about Enrique's contacts, his acquisition networks, everything I've witnessed over the past 3 years. And will you? The question hung between us, complicated by every dimension of my relationship with Enrique. I loved him, had built a career with him, believed in his transformation from his father's legacy to something legitimate. But I'd also seen glimpses of the world he was connected to, heard conversations in languages I didn't understand, witnessed transactions that made me uncomfortable even when assured of their legality. I don't know, I admitted. If he's actually done something illegal, if people have been hurt. But if he hasn't? If this is just federal overreach, looking for crimes that don't exist? Nina leaned forward, her expression intense. Gabby, you need to decide what you believe about him. Not what's convenient or safe, but what you actually think is true. Because that decision is going to define everything that comes next. Over the following weeks, the investigation intensified. More agents, more questions, more documents subpoenaed. Enrique was cooperative but guarded, providing what was requested while revealing nothing beyond the minimum required. I watched him navigate interrogations with the same calm he brought to business negotiations, never losing his composure even as the pressure mounted. The gallery suffered collateral damage. Some collectors withdrew their pieces, concerned about association with an ongoing federal investigation. Critics who'd praised our exhibitions now questioned the legitimacy of our acquisitions. Staff members grew nervous, uncertain whether their employment would survive whatever outcome the investigation produced. Through it all, Enrique remained steadfast. He never asked me to lie, never pressured me to withhold information, never even suggested that my testimony should be anything other than completely truthful. That integrity, visible even under the most intense scrutiny, reinforced my belief that his transformation was real, that the man I loved was genuinely different from his father's legacy. It was during one particularly aggressive questioning session, where agents implied that my cooperation could mean the difference between prosecution and immunity, that I made my decision, not based on what was safe or politically wise, but on what I believed to be true. Enrique Castro has spent 3 years building legitimate business operations, I told the agents clearly, my voice steady despite the fear churning in my stomach. Every acquisition I've witnessed has been properly documented and legally obtained. I've personally verified the provenance of every piece in our gallery. If his past involves questionable activities, I can't speak to that. I didn't know him then. But I can testify to his present, and his present is completely above board. The agents weren't pleased with my statement, but it was truthful, and truth had weight, even when it didn't serve their purposes. Over the next several months, I provided testimony, documentation, and verification of the gallery's operations. I sat through depositions where hostile lawyers tried to trip me into contradicting myself, tried to imply that my relationship with Enrique compromised my objectivity. Ms. Frere, isn't it true that Mr. Castro offered you this position specifically because you were involved romantically? That he's essentially buying your silence about questionable business practices? No. I met the lawyer's eyes steadily, drawing on reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. Enrique offered me this position because I have a master's degree in art conservation, 6 years of experience authenticating Renaissance through modern paintings, and a reputation for integrity that he needed for a gallery focused on legitimate acquisitions. Our personal relationship developed separately from our professional one, and I've maintained ethical standards regardless of that relationship. The question was asked in variations a dozen times across multiple depositions. Each time, I answered with the same unwavering consistency, not because I was protecting Enrique, but because it was the truth. I'd built something real at the gallery, something that existed independent of his complicated past, something worth defending on its own merits. Enrique attended every deposition he was permitted to, sitting in the back of the room with his lawyers, his expression carefully neutral. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands occasionally clenched and released, the subtle signs of stress that only someone who knew him intimately would recognize. During breaks, we'd steal moments together in courthouse hallways or conference room antechambers. He'd pull me into quiet corners, checking that I was holding up under the pressure, apologizing for subjecting me to this scrutiny. "You have nothing to apologize for," I told him during one such moment, my hand finding his and squeezing tightly. "You didn't create this situation deliberately, and I'm choosing to stand here, choosing to testify to what I know is true. That's my decision, not something you're forcing on me." "I love you," he said, the words rough with emotion he rarely showed in public. "Whatever happens, whatever they decide, I love you, and I'm grateful beyond words that you're here." "I love you too," I whispered back, "and we're going to survive this. Together." It became our mantra through the long months of investigation. Together. Whatever the outcome, we'd face it together. The investigation also revealed things I hadn't known about Henrique's transformation. Through subpoenaed documents and testimony from his associates, I learned the full extent of what he'd sacrificed to legitimize his operations. Relationships severed, lucrative deals abandoned, entire revenue streams cut off because they couldn't withstand legal scrutiny. He'd been quietly dismantling his father's empire for years, piece by piece, replacing questionable operations with clean alternatives, even when it cost him significantly. "Did you know he turned down a $50 million acquisition last year?" Teresa, our lawyer, mentioned during one strategy session. The piece was authenticated, legally available. Everything checked out except the broker had ties to Eastern European organized crime. Henrique walked away from the deal entirely rather than engage with that network, even though it would have been completely legal. I hadn't known. Henrique had never mentioned it, had never used his sacrifices as evidence of his transformation. He'd simply done the work quietly, consistently, year after year, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. That revelation strengthened my testimony in the final depositions. I could speak not just to what I'd witnessed directly, but to the pattern of choices I'd learned about through the investigation itself, choices that demonstrated genuine commitment to operating legitimately. 8 months after the investigation began, the federal prosecutor finally announced their decision. I was at the gallery when Henrique called, his voice carrying an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "It's over," he said simply. "They found irregularities in some of my father's historical operations, things I'd already disclosed and distanced myself from. But there's insufficient evidence of ongoing criminal activity. They're not pursuing charges. The gallery is cleared completely. They verified that everything we've done is legitimate." Relief washed over me so intensely that my knees actually buckled. I sat down heavily in my office chair, phone pressed to my ear, tears streaming down my face. "We did it," I whispered. "We survived." "You survived," he corrected gently. "You stood up under pressure that would have broken most people, Gabriela. You defended what we built without compromising your integrity. I will never forget that." That evening, after the gallery closed, we stood together in the main exhibition space, surrounded by the art we'd acquired and displayed with such care. The space felt different now, not just a gallery but a testament to transformation, to the possibility of building something clean from complicated origins. "I'm completely out now," Henrique said quietly, his arm around my waist as we stared at a gorgeous Turner seascape we'd acquired 2 years earlier. The investigation forced me to sever the last ties I'd been managing, burned the final bridges to my father's world. Every contact from that life is gone. It's just the legitimate business now. Just this, just us, just what we've built together. "How do you feel about that?" I asked, leaning into his warmth. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, His voice carried a lightness I'd never heard before. Free. Lighter than I've felt in years. Maybe ever. Like I've been carrying weight I didn't even realize was there until it was finally gone. I turned to face him, seeing the truth of his words written in the relaxed set of his shoulders, the genuine peace in his expression. The investigation, for all its terror and stress, had completed what he'd been working toward for years. Full, undeniable separation from everything his father had built. So what now? I asked, echoing the question I'd posed years ago in this same space. Now we rebuild, he said, his hands coming to rest on my shoulders. The gallery's reputation not only survived, but might actually be stronger for having undergone federal scrutiny. We have clients who stood by us, contacts who remained loyal through everything. We have a foundation that's been tested and proven solid. He paused, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. And we have each other. That's what matters most. Enrique. I know we've talked about the future in abstract terms, he interrupted gently. About building something lasting, about commitment. But these past 8 months, watching you maintain your integrity while still standing beside me, watching you defend what we've built without ever compromising yourself, I've never been more certain of anything. My heart was pounding now, anticipation mixing with the residual adrenaline of the past months. Certain of what? That I want to spend the rest of my life with you, he said simply. Not because you're convenient, not because you make me look legitimate, but because you see who I actually am, both the darkness I came from and the light I'm trying to become. And you love me anyway. You make me want to be worthy of that love. Tears were streaming down my face again, but these were different from the earlier tears of relief. These came from something deeper, from the recognition that we'd not only survived crisis, but had been transformed by it. I love you, I whispered. Completely. Even when it terrifies me. Even when it's complicated. I love you. He pulled me close, holding me with a tenderness that contradicted his powerful frame. We stood there in the quiet gallery, surrounded by centuries of art that had survived wars and revolutions and the simple passage of time, and I felt something settle into place, a certainty that whatever came next, we'd face it together. The investigation was over. The gallery had been vindicated. Enrique's transformation was complete and verified. And we had emerged from the crucible with our relationship not just intact but stronger, forged in the kind of pressure that either destroys or tempers into something unbreakable. We'd chosen unbreakable. As we locked up the gallery that night, walking out into the cool evening air hand in hand, I thought about all the complications that had brought us here. The chance meeting at Nina's party, the protective lie that had started everything, the gradual revelation of Enrique's past, and now this final test that had proven the authenticity of his transformation. Thank you, Enrique said as we walked toward his car, his voice carrying across the quiet street. For what? For believing in me when I gave you every reason not to. For seeing possibility instead of just risk. For loving me through all the complications. He stopped, turning to face me under the streetlights. For being exactly who you are, brilliant, brave, and uncompromising in your integrity. You make it sound like I'm some kind of hero, I said, embarrassed by the praise. I just told the truth. Exactly, he said softly. In a situation where lying would have been easier, where protecting yourself would have been justified, you told the truth. That's precisely what makes you extraordinary. We drove back to his penthouse in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from not needing to fill every moment with words. The city passed outside the windows, familiar and beautiful, and I felt a profound gratitude for this life we'd built. Complicated, yes, but real and ours. That night, as we fell asleep tangled together in his bed, I thought about the future that stretched before us now, no longer shadowed by investigations or the ghosts of his father's empire, just the clean possibility of building something lasting together. We'd survived the worst. Everything that came next would be the reward for that survival, the life we'd fought so hard to protect, finally ours to enjoy without looking over our shoulders. I fell asleep with Henrique's arms around me, and the certainty that we'd reached the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. One written entirely by our choices, our love, our unwavering commitment to building something worth keeping. The storm had passed, and we were still standing. 6 months after the investigation ended, life had finally found a rhythm that felt almost normal. The gallery thrived with renewed energy. Clients who'd withdrawn during the investigation returned. Critics praised our resilience, and we mounted exhibitions that pushed creative boundaries while maintaining the impeccable standards that had always defined our work. Henrique's transformation was complete and visible to everyone. The last remnants of his father's network had been severed during the investigation, forcing a clean break he'd been managing for years. He operated now with a transparency that sometimes surprised even me. Every transaction documented, every acquisition traceable, every business relationship above reproach. We'd settled into a domestic rhythm too. Most nights, Henrique came to my apartment or I went to his penthouse, and we'd cook dinner together, discussing the day's challenges and victories with the ease of people who'd survived crisis and emerged stronger. Nina declared us disgustingly happy, with affectionate exasperation, and I couldn't really argue. It was during one of these ordinary, perfect evenings that I realized my period was late. Not just a day or two, but nearly 3 weeks. Long enough that I couldn't dismiss it as stress or irregular cycles. I stared at myself in my bathroom mirror, counting backwards through the calendar, my heart beginning to race with possibility and terror in equal measure. The pregnancy test I bought on my lunch break the next day confirmed what I'd already known with bone-deep certainty. Pregnant. The word seemed to shimmer with implications, transforming everything it touched. I sat on my bathroom floor, test in hand, trying to process the magnitude of this development. Henrique and I had discussed the future in abstract terms. Marriage eventually, maybe children someday. But this made everything suddenly, urgently concrete. How would he react? We'd been through so much together, had proven our relationship could survive external pressure. But a child was different, permanent, irreversible, a choice that would bind us together regardless of what happened to our romantic relationship. I needed to tell him. But the words felt too enormous for a casual evening conversation, too significant to just blurt out over dinner. This deserved intention, ceremony, acknowledgement of its weight. In the end, I invited him to my apartment 3 days after taking the test. My nerves stretched so tight, I felt like I might shatter at the slightest touch. I cooked his favorite meal, set candles on the small table, tried to create an atmosphere that would soften the shock of what I was about to reveal. "This is lovely," Henrique said as he arrived, taking in the setup with obvious pleasure. "What's the occasion?" "I need to tell you something," I said, my carefully rehearsed words evaporating under the intensity of the moment. "And I don't know how you're going to react, but I need you to know that I'm not trying to trap you or force any decisions. It happened, and now we need to figure out what it means." His expression shifted immediately from pleasure to concern. "Gabriella, you're frightening me. Whatever it is, just tell me." I took a deep breath, then placed the positive pregnancy test on the table between us. "I'm pregnant. About 6 weeks, I think. I just found out a few days ago." The silence that followed felt eternal. I watched emotions flicker across Henrique's face too quickly to identify. Shock, certainly, but also something else, something I couldn't quite read. He stared at the test, then at me, then back at the test, as if it might change under observation. He started, then seemed unable to finish the sentence. "We're going to have a baby?" "I'm going to have a baby," I corrected carefully. "What you want to do about that is your choice. I'm not expecting anything specific. I know this is sudden, and we haven't planned for this. And if you need time to process, marry me." The words cut through my rambling, simple and direct. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "What?" "Marry me, Gabriella." He moved around the table, kneeling before me with none of his usual careful control. His hands found mine, gripping tightly. "Not because you're pregnant. I've been planning to propose for months but couldn't find the right moment after everything we went through with the investigation. But this..." His gaze dropped to my still flat stomach. "This is perfect. You're perfect. We're perfect together, and I want everything. Marriage, this baby, a family, the whole future we've been too cautious to commit to out loud." "Enrique, you don't have to..." "I know I don't have to," he interrupted fiercely. "I want to. I've wanted to for years but was afraid to ask. Afraid that I'd bring too much complication into your life, that you'd be better off without the weight of my past. But the investigation proved we can survive anything together. And now we have this." His hand moved to rest gently on my abdomen. This perfect gift that I don't deserve but will spend the rest of my life being grateful for. Tears were streaming down my face, overwhelming relief mixing with joy I'd been afraid to feel. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you. I want everything too, all of it. The complications and the joy and the terrifying, beautiful future we're going to build." He kissed me then, deep and thorough, tasting of salt from my tears and something that might have been his own. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted. "I've been working with an artist on something special, but it's not ready. I wanted it to be perfect." "I don't need a ring right now," I assured him. "I just need you to be happy about this baby, to want this as much as I already do. Happy doesn't begin to cover it." His hand remained on my stomach, protective and possessive. Terrified, overwhelmed, grateful beyond words. But yes, happy. So incredibly happy. We spent the rest of the evening planning in broad strokes, talking about timeline for the wedding, discussing how to announce the pregnancy to Nina and others, imagining what kind of parents we might become. It felt surreal and perfect, this domestic dreaming after so much crisis and fear. 3 weeks later, Enrique presented me with the ring he'd been designing, the band made from melted down coins his father had salvaged from a shipwreck, transformed into something beautiful. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us, taking something from his father's legacy and reshaping it into something new, something that represented transformation and hope rather than complicated history. "I can't promise you simplicity," he said as he slipped it on my finger in the gallery after hours, surrounded by the art we'd built together. "But I can promise you honesty, loyalty, and every day of trying to be worthy of your faith in me. I can promise that I'll be the best father I know how to be to our child. And I can promise that you'll never doubt my commitment to this family we're creating." "That's all I need," I whispered, admiring the ring through tears that seemed to be my constant companion these days. "Your promises, your presence, your love. Everything else we'll figure out together." We set the wedding for 3 months later. Enough time to plan something meaningful, but soon enough that I'd still be comfortable in a wedding dress. Nina threw herself into planning with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting years for this moment, and I let her take the lead, grateful to focus my energy on the gallery and the growing changes in my body. The pregnancy progressed normally, my morning sickness manageable, the fatigue offset by the excitement of preparing for both a wedding and a baby. Enrique was attentive to the point of being slightly overwhelming, hovering whenever I showed the slightest sign of discomfort, researching pregnancy and childbirth with the same thoroughness he brought to authenticating artwork. "You know women have been doing this for millennia without medical encyclopedias, right?" I teased him one evening, finding him deep in a book about fetal development. "Yes, but none of those women were carrying my child," he replied seriously. I want to understand everything, be prepared for anything. The wedding took place on Nina's terrace, the same location where everything had begun 4 years earlier. We kept it intimate, just close friends and family, with the setting sun painting the city in shades of gold and rose. I wore a simple cream dress with an empire waist that accommodated my small but visible bump, flowers woven through my hair in the style I'd always imagined. As I walked toward Henrique across that familiar terrace, I remembered the night he'd first claimed me as his, a protective lie that had transformed into the most real thing in my life. He'd said, "Not yet," when I'd teasingly asked if I was his, had promised to try earning that title. He'd earned it through years of patient transformation, through crisis that tested every foundation we'd built, through choices that prioritized integrity over expediency. And I'd earned my place beside him through faith maintained when logic argued otherwise, through truth told when silence would have been safer. "Do you remember what you asked me that first night?" Henrique murmured as we stood before the officiant, his hands holding mine. "So, now I'm yours?" I quoted back, smiling through happy tears. And I said not yet. But now, his voice caught with emotion. "Now, yes. You're mine, and I'm yours. And this baby is ours. All of it earned, all of it chosen, all of it real." "Now, yes," I agreed, the words becoming our vows, more meaningful than any traditional promises, because they acknowledged the journey that had brought us here. We married as the sun set over the city, surrounded by the people who'd supported us through everything, in the place where our story had begun. And 6 months later, our daughter entered the world, healthy, perfect, with Henrique's dark hair and my hazel eyes. I'd never seen him cry before, not through the investigation or any of the complications that had marked our relationship. But when the nurse placed our daughter in his arms for the first time, tears streamed down his face unchecked. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're both perfect. I don't deserve this, either of you, but I promise I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of what you've given me." "You already are," I assured him, exhausted but happier than I'd ever been. "You've been proving it for years. This is just the beginning of showing her the same love and dedication you've shown me." Our daughter, we named her Helena, after Henrique's mother, completed our transformation in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Watching Henrique with her, seeing the fierce protectiveness and tender devotion he brought to fatherhood, reinforced everything I'd believed about his capacity for change. The next 3 years passed in the beautiful chaos of new parenthood, combined with the demands of running the gallery. We moved into a larger apartment that could accommodate our growing family, found rhythms that balanced work and parenting, discovered the exhaustion and joy of building a life together in the most concrete possible terms. Helena was bright and curious, equally comfortable among the artwork at the gallery and the playgrounds near our home. She had Henrique's intensity and my tendency toward quiet observation, a combination that made her simultaneously delightful and challenging to parent. For our 3rd wedding anniversary, Henrique suggested celebrating at Nina's terrace again, returning to the place where so many significant moments had occurred. Nina enthusiastically agreed to host, and we found ourselves once again on that familiar space, but this time with Helena between us, holding both our hands as we looked out over the city. "What are you thinking about?" Henrique asked, noticing my contemplative expression. "That first night," I admitted, watching Helena point excitedly at lights below. "When you claimed me as yours to protect me from Hugo. Do you remember what I asked you?" "How could I forget?" His smile was warm with the memory. "You asked if that meant you were mine now. I thought I was in trouble the moment you challenged me like that. Knew you weren't just another beautiful woman at a party, but someone who'd change everything. I asked if I was yours now," I continued, pulling him close with my free hand while Helena explored the terrace's edge under Nina's watchful eye. And you said, "Not yet, but I could try to earn that title." He completed the memory, his arm coming around my waist. "And now?" "Now, yes," I whispered. The same answer we'd given at our wedding, the culmination of years of earning and choosing and building. "I'm yours, and you're mine, and she's ours. All of it earned, all of it chosen, all of it real, despite how impossibly it started." The music from the anniversary celebration drifted out to us. Friends gathered to celebrate not just our marriage, but the family we'd become. 3 years married, nearly 8 years since that first encounter, a lifetime of complications survived and transformed into something worth celebrating. "You know," Enrique said, pulling me closer as we watched Helena dance to music only she could hear. "That night when I called you mine to protect you from your ex, I had no idea what I was committing myself to, what kind of future that moment would create." "Regret it?" I teased, though I knew the answer. "Not for a second." His voice was fierce with certainty. Every complication, every crisis, every moment of doubt, all of it led here, to this moment, to this family. I'd do it all again exactly the same way if it meant ending up here with you. Helena toddled back to us then, demanding to be picked up so she could see the pretty lights better. Enrique lifted her easily, settling her against his hip as we all looked out over the city that had witnessed our entire journey. Standing there on the terrace where it all began, watching our daughter point excitedly at the glittering cityscape while held safely in her father's arms, I felt the perfect symmetry of our story. We'd started with a protective lie between strangers and built it into the most genuine thing in our lives. Proof that people could transform, that love could survive scrutiny, that redemption was possible even from the most complicated beginnings. "Mama, Daddy, look!" Helena's excited voice pulled us from our reflection. She was pointing at the sky where the first stars were becoming visible above the city lights. "I see them, baby," I said, my heart full to bursting with the simple, perfect moment. "We all see them," Enrique added, his arm tightening around me. The whole beautiful future stretched out before us, and standing there together, our family complete, our love proven through crisis and time, our future finally ours to write without shadows. I knew that sometimes the best love stories started with risks taken without thinking, with choices made from instinct rather than logic. Because that night when Enrique Castro had claimed me as his to protect me from my past, he'd unknowingly committed himself to a future neither of us could have imagined. And when I'd challenged him with, "So now I'm yours?" half joking, half serious, I'd unknowingly committed myself to believing in transformation, in redemption, in the possibility that people could become something better than their origins suggested. We'd both earned the titles we'd claimed that night. And standing here now, with our daughter safe between us and our love proven through every test that mattered, I wouldn't change a single moment of the complicated, terrifying, beautiful journey that had brought us here. This was our happy ending. Not perfect, not simple, but real and ours, and worth every risk we'd taken to reach it. The gallery thrived. Our family grew stronger, and every day we woke up grateful for the chance encounter that had transformed both our lives, for the protective lie that had become the truest thing either of us had ever known. We'd started as strangers on a terrace. We'd become partners through crisis, and we'd emerged as a family, tested, proven, unbreakable. Together, always together.